year 11, I'm sorry I'm not there today, and hopefully by watching this video you won't fall behind and we'll still be on track for your mocks. So please just pause it whenever you need to. If you can kind of work out a system in class, if you just make sure you ask whoever's covering you to pause when you need it. I'm going to say myself moments where I think it's worth pausing. Obviously feel free to ignore me. So let's try and get through as much of this as we can, and tomorrow I will finish off that sheet we did today in terms of where the scenes break, etc. And you'll also get your Argo essays back. Okay, so this is the death scene, the final scene of the play. All of the action with Rodrigo and Cassio has already happened in the previous scene. Othello at this point thinks Cassio is dead. Of course he's not. And Iago has sent Emilia to tell Othello what's happened. So that's the kind of context that we're walking into this scene with. So Othello comes in with his lights and he's trying to convince himself at first that what he's doing is correct, and we can see that by the fact that he keeps repeating it is the cause, it is the cause. So he's certainly, a little bit full of doubt. He is going to kill his wife. This is not an easy task for him, but there is still, as you see through the scene, an element of him being a bit overconfident and oversure that he is doing the right thing and the moral thing. So he says here that how he's going to kill her, and he says how he's not going to shed her blood. He doesn't want to scar the skin that is whiter than snow. So there's an element there that he's trying to protect her appearance. He wants her to stay as smooth as marble, which is monumental alabaster. He wants to preserve that innocence and that pure beauty that he fell in love with. I guess as a way of paying homage to her, and actually, but believes that underneath she's completely vile and corrupted. And that is why, yes, yet she must die. So that modal verb there suggests that, he has no choice but to kill her. And this is his justification, which is quite interesting. It's not she must die because she has betrayed me, or she's ruined my reputation, or I love her so much and I'm so angry at her for doing this. He's concerned that she'll betray more men. And this is, I think, arguably a very weak justification. And actually, he's just trying to give himself a more moral justification that he's been personally betrayed. Okay, I think it might be worth pausing there. So he goes on to say that he basically compares putting out the light of the candle that he's holding with putting out the light of Desdemona's life, which is the metaphor that light is life. And he says that, if I was to stop the candle, then I would be able to bring it back. But once I kill you, I don't know where to find. The Promethean heat is essentially, if you have a look here, it tells you in Greek mythology. So it was used to bring mortals back from the dead. So he's essentially saying there, I can't bring you back from the dead if I regret this. And he's kind of, I suppose, highlighting to himself the significance of his actions. It's essentially irreversible. Okay, and then he compares her again to a flower. He says, when I've plucked your rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It has to wither away. Okay, so it's very much thinking about the consequence of his actions. He's making sure he realizes himself, are you sure you want to do this, almost? And then he kisses her one last time. Well, not one last time because he keeps kissing her. Because he obviously still does love her, still thinks she's beautiful, etc. And she is asleep at this point, so not great. So he kisses her several more times in this speech, and he says here, "Oh, your balmy breath that does almost persuade justice to break her sword." So justice breaking her sword is a metaphor for him basically saying, your breath is almost persuading me not to give you justice by killing you. And it's very interesting that he thinks he's bringing justice to Desdemona. So one more means he's kissing her one more time, then one more time. He says, I'll kill you, but I'll love you after. And at the bottom he says he knows that he will cry, but then he compares himself to God. So this, it strikes where if doth love, if you have a look here, is a biblical reference. And it's the idea that he's suggesting there that, just like people in the Old Testament, we have to kill the ones we love, and that's the suffering that we must do. And the line itself, if you have a look there on the other page, a biblical phrase, for whom the Lord loveth he chastened. So in this what Othello's doing there is obviously he's even that spiritual justification, but he positions himself as the same. He is God in this situation. He's saying that I have to kill as well. I have to chastise and punish the people that I love as well. So he's trying to give himself this biblical weight to his actions, and justify what he's doing. Now, even though that is really despicable, it is perhaps better than Iago, who wouldn't even bother to do that. He just commit the evil acts and not really even try to convince himself that God is on his side. So Desdemona starts stirring. If you want to pause now and just make sure you're happy with this page. He's like, oh, who's there? Who's there? Now, Othello asks, have you prayed tonight, Desdemona? Because he wants to protect her soul. So it's this idea of the last rites, and that, you should pray before you die to make sure that you can get into heaven and confess your sins one last time. He continues to say, make sure if you've got any other crimes. Desdemona's saying, what do you mean by that? And he says, I would not kill thy soul. So he doesn't want her to not go to heaven or not to be able to, live on in the afterlife. How considerate of Othello. This is the first, of course, Desdemona's heard of the idea of killing. Talk you of killing? Yes, I do. And Desdemona says, heaven have mercy on me. So that's her very Christian response to finding out that he's thinking of killing her. And Othello, again, very spiritually says, amen with all my heart. He doesn't want her to suffer in the afterlife. If you want to pause there. Okay, so the second half of this page is essentially, it gets increasingly tense and it's increasingly climatic. So Desdemona says that she fears Othello because of the way he's moving his eyes, because of the way he's talking to her. And this links back, nice cross-reference to Act 1, Scene 3, when when Brabantio says that she fell in love with what she feared to look upon. And Brabantio says that in the context of he can't believe that Desdemona would love Brabantio. So it's a really nice reference back that actually now she does fear him. And Othello has become what society's low expectations of him were. And this is a result perhaps of trying to become an insider. There is an argument that this is Shakespeare correcting society and that Desdemona and Othello broke a rule by getting married and they both had to be punished for that. We'll talk about that a bit more in class. So Othello, lots of short utterances, so that's a spoken sentence, and lots of imperatives telling Desdemona what to do, and Desdemona is still saying they are loves I bear to you. So she's still, defending himself and saying that's my sin, that I'm loving you, more than God. At the bottom here, again, we get more. You remember I said, oh no, you won't have seen because this is your homework, but in Act 4, we gradually see that other characters are telling us more about Othello's state of mind. So here, why are you gnawing so your nether lip? So he's biting on his bottom lip, and gnawing suggests that he's really eating away at it. And some bloody passion shakes your very frame. So we can see that Othello's not really in control, that he's being overpowered by his emotions, as he has been since Act 3, Scene 3. Othello has been in a very intense emotional place for 3 acts now. He's obviously not in control, and Desdemona's words there highlight that to us, and she just hopes that he's not going to essentially take that out on her. So if you want to pause there, make sure you're happy with that page. Okay. On this page, though, when you look at how Othello speaks, and it's quite calm and collected, and we know that obviously, he's what Desdemona's just said about him, and he's gnawing away his lip, but he's also very just the way he speaks is very resolved. Like, he knows what he wants to do and he's going to do it, and it's that idea of a killer just sat there saying, I'm going to kill you no matter what you say. And there's something really unnerving about Othello on this page, and of course we know what he's building up to do. So he finally, some of you will be very happy to know, he finally explains that he thinks that she's cheated with Cassio, and he says to her here, you the handkerchief that I gave you've given to Cassio. And Desdemona defends herself, no, by my life and soul, straight away, she swears on her life and her soul, and asks him, says, send for the man and ask him. And if only Desdemona had done this earlier, and if only Othello had ever done that, but of course he never has. And then this is, I think, one of the most unnerving lines. Sweet soul, take heed. Take heed of perjury, thou art out on thy deathbed. So there's the sibilance there, the repetition of the S sounds. Sweet soul, take heed. And I guess the kind of monosyllabic words, that, one syllable per word, pretty much. It's very calm, very soft, very measured. And it's just really, really unnerving. And still being, I guess it's the fact that he's given her a compliment, sweet soul, whilst also threatening her and warning her, you're going to die soon, so you shouldn't lie, because you will end up in perjury if you lie, because that's sinful. And Desdemona can't believe that, surely I'm not going to die. And he says, yes, presently. It's just really, really calm and cruel almost to tell someone they're going to die. It just evokes fear. Like, it would have been nicer to her to not tell her what was going to happen, perhaps. And he says essentially, hey, you might as well be honest, because you're going to die anyway, and you might as well be honest because there's no point in lying anymore. So even now, he's just completely convinced that she's lying, and he says it to her very clearly, thou art to die. Okay, if you want to pause there if you haven't already. Okay, not much to say for the rest of the page, because it essentially carries on in the same idea that Desdemona is defending herself and Othello is saying, you're going to die, stop perjuring yourself. Desdemona throughout the scene is consistently acting as a really good Christian that, of course, the Shakespeare audience would have really respected her for, and thought that it would have evoked a lot more sympathy for her. She says that she never loved Cassio, she never gave him token. She's defending herself as best she can at this very late stage, and she must be really scared. And Othello is just saying, I saw it in his hand, so you're lying. And then he says that she stones his heart. So stone here is a verb, and it cross-references really lovely to a line in Act 4, Scene 1, which you won't have watched yet, but it's on page 155 if you want to go back to it in your books. And it essentially is when he says, my heart is turned to stone, which in turn links really nicely to Act 3 when he says that Desdemona's jesses are his heartstrings. So those three quotes together can really map out the journey that Othello's been in from Act 3, 4 and 5. So if you pause there so that you can make sure you've got that cross-reference down. So underneath then, Desdemona again says, send for Cassio, he will tell you. But Othello says, well, he's already confessed, which of course he hasn't, because Othello misinterpreted the conversation and thought that he was speaking about Bianca. And Desdemona says he wouldn't confess because it's a lie. But then Othello's response is to say no, because his mouth is stopped. So Othello confirms actually he can't say that. He would not say that anymore because he's now dead, which of course Othello is mistaken in thinking that. Now, unfortunately, Desdemona reacts quite badly to this and starts crying on the next page. Actually, just before we turn over, I actually think that bottom line on this bottom speech from Othello, where he says, sorry, I can't really show you. He says, "Add all this hers being lies, lives, my great revenge had stomach for them all," is essentially saying that if every hair on Cassio's head represented a life that Cassio had lived, he would have killed all of them. So again, very violent and ironic, given that he never killed Cassio at all. He got Iago to do it. So again, there's a sense here of him being very angry and sort of, look at what I can do, and I'm full of anger and revenge, when actually he didn't actually do it himself. He got Iago to do it, and Iago did not do it properly. Okay, so now we're on page 201, if you want to pause before we start. So as I just said, Desdemona starts crying, and he calls her a whore again, strumpet, and he says, weepest thou for him to my face. And he's really, really angry there that Desdemona is crying about Cassio's death. But I think what we have to think about here is that, of course, Desdemona probably is quite sad that Cassio's died, but actually it's probably that she's crying because the realization that this is real. Like, if Cassio's dead, this is really a thing. Cassio can't prove that I didn't cheat with him, and I am very likely to die. This Othello has arranged for Cassio to die, and she knows that he is Cassio's friend. So at this point, Desdemona gets very desperate, and you can see those quotations I've highlighted there. Banish me, my lord, but don't kill me. Kill me tomorrow. Let me live tonight. Give me half an hour. So she goes from saying at first, do you remember in Act 3 where he says that he'll witter her away to fend for herself in his soliloquy? He says, he'll just let her go. That's essentially what Desdemona asks for here. Banish me, don't kill me. Her demands or pleads get even smaller and smaller. So she asks for half an hour to live more, which obviously she'd probably try to convince him. And then she just asks to say a prayer. And Othello doesn't give her that. After everything he's just said about forgive your sins, etc., etc., he doesn't give her that chance. And her last 3 words at this point are, oh Lord, Lord, Lord. And we don't know whether she's speaking to God there or Othello, because she calls Othello Lord, my Lord all the time, doesn't she? And he smothers her. So obviously make sure you've highlighted those stage directions about the fact that he smothers her. And then straight away, Emilia starts shouting at the door, which obviously is really good timing and creates really good dramatic effects on stage. I think you should pause there and just make sure you've got those quotations highlighted. So the rest of the page is essentially Othello talking to himself about opening the door for Emilia, working out it's Emilia, assuming that she's come to tell him that Cassio is dead, which is there. Asking himself what's best to do. He makes sure that Desdemona is dead. I think she stirs again. She's not quite dead yet. And then my wife, what wife? I have no wife. And then these exclamatives here. Oh, unsupportable. Oh, heavy hour. There is obviously an emotional reaction. He can't cope. He's feeling the grief of Desdemona's death as much as if somebody else had killed her, and that realization now that he has no wife anymore at his own hands. I mean, he did know what he was walking into. Methinks it should now be a huge eclipse. So that's the impact. His whole world has been eclipsed. He's got no sunlight anymore. It's all just really tragic, and that's the whole point, isn't it? We're supposed to sit here thinking, what a tragic waste. You're devastated she's dead. She didn't deserve to die. She never cheated on you, etc. So eventually Emilia says, I need to speak to you. Othello says, I'd forgotten thee, so that's how distracted he is, and that maybe is worth highlighting, actually, that, he's really not with it. He's completely disorientated, and he unlocks the door, and he lets Emilia in. If you want to pause there before we turn over. I guess the last thing to say here, and I'm sorry we're not doing this in class together, is this. I know it just says he smothers her because that's traditional stage directions in Shakespeare's time. He wasn't one, it was not traditional at the time to do really detailed stage directions, but actually really think about the impact for the audience of seeing Desdemona smothered on stage. This very pure, desperate woman who's just begged to say a prayer. Okay, let's turn over. Right, 203. There's a sense here that Othello was sort of blaming the supernatural, and he says here, it is the very error of the moon. She comes more near the earth than she was wont, and makes men mad. So he's kind of blaming the moon and the supernatural for all these murders that are happening, including presumably the murder that he's just committed. And that kind of links again to Shakespearean tragedies, and that there's always that tendency to blame a bigger power. Actually, what Shakespeare's highlighting here is that there is no bigger power. It is just Othello and his flaws, and it is a very human tragedy. Unless you want to argue that Iago's masterful wordplay is, in a way, supernatural. Okay, if you want to pause there and jot that down, because that's quite involved, isn't it? Okay, so Emilia reveals to Othello that Cassio has not been killed, and then Othello says, sweet revenge grows harsh, which is really lovely antithesis. Sweet and harsh. Is it antithesis? Not quite contrast, is it? Because the opposite of sweet is bitter. But there's the sense there that his revenge is feeling less satisfying because Cassio's not dead. Of course, the fact that that makes the revenge go harsh rather than his own wife being murdered is another matter. And then Desdemona actually comes back to life. So just make sure you've got that plot point very clear. He thinks she's dead. She says, "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord," as her last words. But then these are our actual last words on this page. So she comes back alive temporarily, not literally, she's obviously nearly dead, saying, "Oh, falsely murdered." So she wants to make sure that Amelia knows that it was wrong that she was murdered. She was innocent. So one of her last words is to claim that she's innocent. Amelia at this point realizes that Desdemona's in the room and goes to look for her. That was my lady's voice. And then she draws back the bed curtains, if you imagine a four-poster bed, and there is Desdemona behind that, and she shouts help, and she begs Desdemona to speak again. Sweet Desdemona, oh sweet mistress. So a loving response there, obviously, because she's obviously very, very worried about a friend. And then Desdemona says, "A guiltless death I die." So this is a repetition of what she's saying here. She wants to clearly highlight that she's completely guiltless and she's completely innocent, because that's what really matters to her. Amelia asks who's killed her, even though it's kind of obvious because Othello was behind a locked door. And Desdemona's final words, because she actually dies here, is to say, "Nobody, I myself." So she defends Othello literally in her last breath and says, "Farewell. Commend me to my kind lord." So, oh, farewell. So she wants Amelia to say to Othello, "I did not cheat on Cassio." That's what preoccupies Desdemona as she dies. And she does not blame Othello. She does not say that he killed her. So loyal to her very last breath to a man who murdered her for thinking she was disloyal. Okay, if you want to pause there. Right, Othello has a really low point at the bottom of this page. When he's, Amelia then of course says, who did this? And Othello says, "You heard her say herself, it was not I." And I really think that's really conniving for him to say that. Of course he killed her, but he's almost using Desdemona's sweet innocence and defense of Othello to try and get out of the murder. But it is very temporary, so make sure you keep that in mind. And because literally you can see here, she was a liar. She's like a liar gone to burning hell, so that's where he thinks she's gone and where she deserves to go. It was I that killed her. So he boldly admits it, just literally, another speech later. Amelia calls him the blacker devil. And Othello just very bluntly defends himself. She turned to folly, which is sin, and she was a whore. So that's his justification, and he's not at all ashamed here. This is a very bold declaration, and he's very much what's the word? He's owning what he's done. He's completely convinced that it was the right thing to do. Amelia says you just belie her, so that's a lie. You tell lies about her, and she calls him the devil. When Othello says here she was as false as water, we can really explain explore the connotations of water. It's very fluid, it's transitory, it's changeable, and obviously that suggests that she wasn't who she seemed to be. She was someone who changed all the time, which again is ironic because Desdemona has been a very consistent character all the way through the play, almost as far as to say that she's quite a flat character, not a round one. And then Amelia can't just quite see there. Amelia says, "Thou art as rash as fire." So I think it's very interesting to explore the connotations of fire and how it's very consuming and it is rash. And then we've got the idea of the relationship between fire and water, and of course water can put out fire. So you could argue symbolically here that if Othello had given Desdemona a chance, that actually her beautiful water would have, quenched that fire and reduced Othello's rashness if she'd have had more time to be his wife, which of course Iago didn't allow them to have. And And I think fire at this point is a really good, it's a simile here, as Rashaz, and then Othello's is a simile as well. Because absolutely, Othello is just consuming and destroying everything because of the jealousy inside him. Okay, make sure you make sure you get those connotations down for the words water and fire. Hope you like my son's tablecloth. Okay, so last page that I'm going to go through today is when Othello basically then reveals at the top of page 205 that, ask your husband. He says Cassio did top her, very crude language, and top her is very much an Iago line, isn't it? And that's the kind of thing Iago says. And he says, thy husband knew it all. My husband, thy husband. And you can see it all the way down here. Amelia is in shock because she keeps repeating my husband. And I also feel like it's almost like she's working this out in her head. Surely not, surely not, surely not. Because Amelia knows without doubt that Desdemona has not cheated. So if her husband has said that she has, then she knows immediately that he is being a villain here. In this speech here, sorry if you want to pause there to highlight all the husbands. In this speech here, Othello essentially says, if she had been true, I would not have sold her for the entire world, for an amazing stone or perfect crystal. So it's the idea, this is very cruelly ironic, that there was just this one flaw, and that otherwise he just would have kept her forever and loved her forever and treasured her forever and wouldn't have traded even really precious things for her. And it's so terribly tragic because she was true. We then have here, Othello calls Iago honest so many times. It was Iago who told me on her first. An honest man he is, and he hates the slime that sticks on filthy deeds. There was never a less true line said about Iago. That is ironically completely the opposite. He loves the slime that sticks on filthy deeds. Even more than that, he creates them. So perfect proof that Othello has really lost all sense of what of who Iago is. That he's really gullible and he's really been misled by him. Okay, so Othello starts to lose patience again. There's plenty of times in the play he loses patience. If you want to pause there, actually. And he says, "I say, thy husband. What needs this iterance, woman? Why do you keep repeating yourself? I have said your husband." And then he says again here, "Do you not understand the word, your husband?" So you remember he said he calls her a simple board. Oh, you won't, because that's part of your homework. But simple broad. Sorry. He calls her that in Act 4, Scene 2. Okay. So he gets very frustrated with Amelia, and I think it's almost comical, that bit. It depends on the production of the play, whether they play it for laughs, given the seriousness of the situation. And Othello says, "My friend, your husband, honest Iago." Again, ironic, terrible how misled Othello has been. And Amelia says, "If he has said so, then he has a pernicious soul, an evil soul. Never was a truer word spoken about Iago." So you've got that great contrast there, that Amelia actually sees him for what he is now, where Othello still does not. And Amelia says this really tragic line here about Desdemona. She basically paid a high price. She was too fond of her most filthy bargain, and her most filthy bargain is Othello and her marriage. And she paid a really, really bad price for falling in love with Othello. Now, even though Othello only says ha here, if you see Amelia's language, she says, "Do thy worst. Anything you do is no more worthy of heaven than Desdemona. You were worthy of her." In other words, your deeds are awful, and what you've done is not worthy of heaven, just like you weren't worthy of her. And there's a sense that she feels threatened here, but also in control. She's being very confident. It's the equivalent of saying, "Bring it on." So she can obviously see in Othello here, even though it's not written down, that he's planning on attacking her or accusing her because she's just insulted him and called him a filthy bargain. So there's a lot of bravery here. And, he essentially says here, you are best to be at peace, which means shut up, essentially. And Amelia says here, you have not half the power to do me harm as I have to be hurt. And what she means by that is she's saying, you can't hurt me any more than I'm already hurting because of what you've done to Desdemona. If you want to pause there, write that down. You definitely will have needed to pause before that. Sorry, I got a bit carried away. And again, Amelia is really, really brave here, and she says, I will make thee known. I care not for thy sword. I'm not threatened by your sword and what you're threatening to me for me with. So there's a real sense here that Othello is being very like using a lot of masculine power over her, sort of maybe walking towards her on the stage, certainly brandishing his sword towards her as if to say, in a threatening manner. And Amelia is standing firm and saying, I'm going to make you known. I'm going to make sure people know about this. And she calls for help. Now, it's a little bit, arguably, some people argue that this is too little too late in support of Desdemona, that she should have not stolen the handkerchief. She could have told her that she had taken the handkerchief. But at this point, Amelia is brave, and we can't really take that away from her because she is risking her life for justice for her friend at this point. So I'm just going to check that was where I want to go to. It was. If by any chance you have got all the way to this and the lesson isn't finished, then I am very happy and trust you to just get on with reading back over things or discussing the annotations to this scene. You've got plenty to be getting on with, or maybe actually you might just appreciate a breather for once. Obviously discuss that with the cover teacher in terms of what that breather looks like and whether it's just you discussing things informally. Okay, I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, and I hope this was useful. Thanks, guys.